podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week we are talking about trauma-based relationships, prevention, and self-awareness. My name is Hannah Jenarine, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Education and Prevention Coordinator at the Victim Service Center. With me today, I have Leslie, who is a counselor in Orlando, Florida, and who specializes in trauma and PTSD, along with depression and family conflict. Leslie, thank you so much for joining me today. Can you please share with our audience a little more about who you are and what you do?
Thank you, Hannah, and I so appreciate the Victim Services Center for having me today. My name is Leslie Pender. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in Orlando, Florida. My pronouns are she and her. And my educational background is in mental health counseling. I have my master's degree from Capella in mental health counseling, and my bachelor's degree is in social sciences with a concentration in sociology from the University of Maryland, University College. My background and some of the clients that I've worked with kind of varies. I focus on clients ages 12 and up. And most of the work I do is focus in trauma work as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of that work has stemmed from my work with the foster care system. During my internship and practicum in my graduate work, I had the opportunity to work with the Department of Children and Families and working with children in foster care and helping families as they go through the pre and post-adoptive pathways. And in that work, I learned a lot about how trauma shows up in the family dynamic with the parents, with the children, especially the children in foster care who are in that particular system because of trauma. They may have been removed from their families due to neglect, due to parent alienation, due to parent substance abuse or mental health challenges. And so therefore, that particular population deals a lot with post-traumatic stress disorder.
So in your field of work, you have met many individuals, as you've expressed, who have experienced trauma within their relationships. So Leslie, I would first like to start off by asking you, how does one's trauma impact a relationship?
Oh, Hannah, that's a great question. It impacts a relationship on so many levels. One of the ways trauma may show up in a relationship is how a person attaches within a relationship. And that kind of talks about attachment styles. And with that, there are 4 attachment styles. There's secure, avoidant, anxious, and disorganized. And attachment stems from, and the attachment style theory stems from the perspective of how a child attaches to their parent in their childhood, whether or not that parent is attuned to a child's needs. And so if the parent is very attuned to a child's need, a child may be secure in their relationship with their parent and is able to emotionally regulate, and that will show up in our adult relationships. Now, with that, the last 3, the avoidant, anxious, and disorganized styles of attachment are considered the insecure attachment styles. And that's what you may see showing up as it relates to someone's trauma, how that impacts the relationship. It may show up as that fear of abandonment, that fear of rejection. Safety may be an issue as it relates to that fear of rejection and abandonment. That person may not have healthy boundaries, which will impact their ability to leave a very unsafe relationship. The security that a person may feel or lack thereof due to their trauma is impacted in a relationship. For example, again, going back to the emotional abuse or physical abuse in a relationship, a person may lose their sense of security as it relates to who they are and what their needs are in the effort to keep the relationship. So therefore, because of their fear of rejection, because of their fear of abandonment, they may not address their needs in order to make sure their partner, who may be the abuser, will be satisfied within the relationship. And that can become very dangerous. That leads to codependency. That leads to being exposed to just different types of emotional injuries. I know we had talked about in our initial conversation together, grief and the loss of self, the loss of what we need for ourselves can come up because of our trauma in relationships, because of our inability to sit there and say, I need to feel safe. However, I might not know what that looks like because of my past traumas. And that typically again stems from childhood experiences. There is a adverse childhood experience, the ACE
Mhm.
questionnaire, that is now kind of being administered in a lot of intake with therapists. And what that does is kind of assess what a person's childhood experience may have been, whether they were exposed to domestic violence in the home, were they exposed to any kind of trauma, whether it's emotional, physical, or sexual trauma. And that kind of gives a therapist an idea of, okay, how is this person navigating these experiences? How has that internalized with this particular individual, and how that might show up in their relationships, not only with others, but also with themselves?
Thank you, Leslie. So, from what I got out of that, people's relationships from their early years, from when they were raised, who they're surrounded with, and the circumstances and situations that happen to them, this can influence how they treat others within a relationship and how they are within themselves. So, when it comes to relationships, whether this is an intimate relationship or whether this is a non-intimate relationship, meaning like with your friends, your family, your coworkers, professors, classmates, what are common trauma bonding signs? And how do you know if a trauma bond exists within your relationship? And I know that's a very loaded question, so take your time.
Not loaded at all. I think, and that's really interesting that you bring up trauma bond, because I, as a clinician, really started hearing more about trauma bonds within the past several years. And trauma bond was actually introduced by Dr. Patrick Carnes in 1997, and his work is more in the addiction space. So we kind of see a lot of that, thinking about codependency. We see a lot of that coming out in the addiction space and addiction therapy. So a trauma bond is really described as this coming together of individuals, not from a very healthy space, but more or less from the bonds of their trauma. And what that may look like, you did say it was a little question, but what that might look like is several different things. It might look like the you complete me
Mhm.
mindset, versus that person being kind of interdependent. They become very dependent upon the person they're in a relationship with. And again, non-intimate or intimate, because you can have codependency within friendships, you can have codependencies within family dynamics. That may look like enmeshment. The relationships are often chaotic and unpredictable in their emotional nature. There is this desire to fix or save or validate
Mhm.
one's existence through someone else. The betrayal of needs is so dynamic in the trauma bond that you again, you compromise your needs for the sake of someone else. You're saying to yourself that, my needs don't matter because I'm scared that I'm going to lose you. So therefore, I put my needs on the back burner. It mirrors the patterns of your childhood existence. So, for example, oftentimes a trauma bond may look like your parents' relationship or any relationship, unhealthy relationship. Let me put it that way. Or it might look like any other unhealthy relationship dynamics you may have experienced growing up. Some of these learned behaviors, again, the betrayal of your needs, the fixing and saving, having that savior complex. I need to save. I need to save,
Mhm.
and that is some of the signs of a trauma bond. Some of the red flags of a trauma bond. I hope that answers your
No,
question.
that was perfect. That was perfect. Thank you, Leslie. That definitely gave me some deeper insights into what that looks like within friendships. And it's actually making me ponder over some of the relationships that I have in my life with my friends because it's asking myself, okay, yes, I've been friends with this person for X amount of years, but in this friendship, sometimes I feel like I'm compromising my emotional needs, my values, my boundaries in order for them to feel better about themselves or in order to ensure that, okay, I'm not offending this person. So thank you for explaining that. So the question now is, and I know you touched on this a little earlier on, but how is trauma bonding formed and why does it happen?
Trauma bonding can be formed in so many different ways. It's very funny. You often feel like, oh my gosh, this person really understands me.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times when you find out that, you both may have had similar experiences growing up. But the thing about that is that's okay if you both have started to heal from those traumas in your childhood. But if there is a pattern of these emotional roller coaster moments, this unpredictability, you recognize that, oh, wait a minute, this is not healthy. And sometimes it takes a while to get to that point, because you mentioned something about, putting your needs on the back burner and some of your friendships and boundaries. Oftentimes in a relationship that is maybe considered a trauma bond, you'll find that there are a lack of boundaries, a lack of healthy boundaries, a lack of understanding that, each person has an opinion, and it's okay that each person has a different opinion, but they're not able to be able to connect in a healthy way. Is
Right.
in short, there's always some drama going on, it seems like, in this type of relationship. Again, someone is always sacrificing, or both could be sacrificing their own needs. And kind of going back to some of the things that you might find in someone who may engage in a trauma bond, like this people pleasing. And again, it goes back to the fear of abandonment, a fear of rejection. It goes back to, again, the childhood experience and how that child may not have had their needs met by the very people who were supposed to, their parents who were supposed to meet their needs. And so again, you kind of try to see yourself trying to get those needs met as an adult within the relationship.
Quick question, Leslie. As a child, you say that it's important that they have their needs met. Have you ever come across someone, or is it possible for a child to be raised in an environment where all of their needs are met? Is anyone free from trauma, per se?
Oh, great question, Hannah. I think, and this is just my opinion, I think in some aspects, we all may have experienced some level of trauma, whether it's direct or we may have had a friend who may be going through something. So that's called vicarious trauma, secondary trauma. We may have had a very secure home environment, but our neighborhood may have not been the best. So if you could have a great, relationship with your mom and your dad, your parent, and have to walk to school past violent situations, that can be traumatic. And to answer your question, I think to some degree we may have all experienced some level of trauma, but not to the degree that sometimes when we think of trauma, and it doesn't also have to mean, emotional trauma. Could have been in a car accident. That's traumatic. Or we may have known someone who was in a car accident and didn't survive. That's traumatic. We may have had a close relationship with a grandparent and they passed away. That's traumatic. So I think to some degree, when we kind of think of trauma, we got to kind of get out of the context of it's, because most times when we think of PTSD, we think of veterans, or we think of domestic abuse. When I think of PTSD, 2001, 9/11, we all was exposed to that because it kept playing on and on. Rightfully so, for us to be informed. I can't think of one person who did not walk away and was not traumatized by that particular day. So yes, we can all have grown up in a secure home, but there could be things that impact our safety and our security that could cause us to have some level of trauma, and that might show up depressed mood, anxiety, those type of things. So I hope that answered your
That
question.
was perfect. So that just goes to show that we are never in full control of what happens around us.
That's
So, like you said, whether that's a death in the family, whether it's a traumatic situation like 9/11, whether it's getting into a car accident. And our environment, as you said, largely influences our belief systems, how we interact with people. So, can you talk more about the environment, not only in which we were raised, but also our environment in regards to social media? Because nowadays, everything is becoming technological. We're always on our phones, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, you just scroll,
Mhm.
everybody is immersed in these apps. So, can you touch on how trauma bonding can be learned from these types of environments?
Oh, great. That's an awesome question. To kind of go back to something that you mentioned as it relates to belief systems. Oftentimes trauma internalized can create core beliefs, irrational core beliefs about who we are as individuals. So, for instance, if a child is not getting the attention and love that they should receive from their parent, that is traumatic because a need is not being met. That's a basic need. And so, therefore, that child may internalize as I'm not good enough. So, that's a irrational core belief. And that kind of shows up. Um, and in their relationship with themselves and the relationship with others that could lead to self-sabotage on a whole nother level. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Mhm.
But to answer your question, the environment and a lot of the learned behaviors can impact our ability to engage in relationships that may have a trauma bond. As it relates to social media, that might exasperate
Mhm.
some of these irrational core beliefs we may have based upon ourselves, based upon the trauma we may have experienced. You look at how beauty is defined, how living your best life
Yeah.
may be defined. A
Mhm.
lot of that is defined by social media. So living your best life, like, oh, I'm on the yacht in the Mediterranean and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And I'm like, yeah, not everybody is doing that. But if that is the definition
Mhm.
of what a best life is, that exasperates a person's core belief if they have a core belief, I'm not good enough or I'm a failure or whatever the case may be. So the key to that is really defining for yourself, what is my best life?
Mhm.
And social media is just a fraction of what's really going on. People are going to put their best faces forward on social media.
Of
No one's
course.
going to sit there and say, oh my gosh, I had a bad hair day. I'm not feeling, my best self, but I'm still here. You're really going to see that. You're really going to see that level of authenticity, that level of vulnerability,
Mhm.
that level of transparency, because that's huge.
Mhm.
That's a huge space to be in, and a lot of people are scared to have that their vulnerable selves out there because of, again, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment. But social media has taken, and even with some of the teenage clients that I had, they will tell you how much social media has impacted their view of their well-being, emotional and mental well-being. Some of my young adult clients who grew up, that's social media, because
That's all they
I'm a
know.
little bit seasoned.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm so glad social media was not around when I was a teenager, but social media has impacted a lot of our young people's view of who they are.
Mhm.
They want to, get to this point where they look like a certain celebrity or they have what a certain celebrity has, and not realizing that happiness is living your best life.
Mhm.
Joy is living your best life.
Mhm.
Being comfortable in your own skin and loving you for who you are. is living your best life. And it takes work to get to that space. But social media has really impacted that. But what I'm liking though now, I'm seeing more positive affirmations, more focus on mental wellness and mental well-being and emotional well-being now in social media than I had in the past. And it's counteracting that perceived you living your best life image, where now people are focusing on their joy and focusing on who they are. And I'm loving that. So hopefully what social media may have started, social media will also be the remedy for that.
Exactly.
So that's the hope.
And something that I do see a lot of when it comes to social media is obviously celebrities are on social media and their relationships are full on display. You get the insider on everything. So when people, they're reading their comments, they're seeing what's happening, they're seeing the most quote unquote beautiful celebrities with this person and what that relationship looks like. For young adults as well, they can also start to internalize that and say, well, if my boyfriend or my girlfriend isn't doing this for me or buying this for me or providing this for me, then I don't want it. So
Exactly.
it's important, and we'll definitely talk about this later about self-awareness and to recognize that what you're seeing isn't always the truth, and that what you're seeing in many cases aren't true displays of what a healthy relationship looks like.
Oh, yes.
So before we
Yep.
talk more about self-awareness and healthy relationships, I do want to ask, what effect does a trauma bond have on an individual, whether that relationship is intimate or non-intimate?
Okay. Before I answer that question, Hannah, I want to go back to the statement you just said, and
Yeah, of course.
I really want to kind of hone in onto that. You mentioned something so profound: the hashtag relationship goals, right? When we look at some of these TV shows, Love and Hip Hop and Married at First Sight, and I'm like, oh, as a clinician, I'm like, oh, I cannot watch this. This is a train wreck waiting to happen. Because it gives this skewed view on how to get to a space of identifying healthy relationship green flags.
Yes.
And that is something, and I think this kind of speaks to the question you just asked as it relates to, the impact and the effect of a trauma bond on an individual. The depression is very real with that, because again, if your needs are not being met, and if there is an internal irrational core belief of I'm not lovable or I'm not, enough, and you're constantly finding yourself in these relationships that impact your self-esteem, that you feel that you're not cared for, that amps up your anxiety and depression to levels that impact your ability to function on a day-to-day basis. You're constantly hyper vigilant. You're constantly concerned whether or not this person is going to leave. So therefore, it impacts your ability to sleep. It impacts your ability to, show up for yourself. Some of the things of activities of daily living is just basic take care of yourself. Are you able to sleep? Are you engaging in healthy eating habits? Are you, really taking care of yourself? Something as simple as, hygiene can be impacted with depression and anxiety if it's to that point where it's impacting your ability to show up for yourself every day. So there are several ways that that trauma bond can impact you as an individual, and the biggest thing it does impact is your sense of safety and your sense of security, your security in the relationship, your personal safety, because you may allow yourself to sacrifice your needs. And especially that shows up in relationships that are domestic violent in its nature. So again, the impact is far reaching. Codependency, some of the codependency traits from a cognitive perspective is difficulty in differentiating your opinion versus the opinion of others. In other words, you start taking on other people's opinion versus saying, well, this is how I feel and this is what I think. From an emotional perspective, there are boundary issues. You're not saying no. And if you do want to say no, there's this level of guilt that comes with that. From a behavioral perspective, you are enduring connections and relationships that are not healthy for you. So it impacts cognitively, it impacts emotionally, and it impacts behaviorally if you're engaging in a trauma bond as the individual.
Something that recurs during this conversation, something that I want to point out, is basic needs.
Mm-hmm.
And as you always say, once our basic needs are not met, that continuously begins to show up in our lives to the people we meet, we talk to, the relationships we have with them.
When we say basic needs, that comes from Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes. Yes.
And so if my psychology majors out there, or those who've taken an intro to psychology, we know that on that lower tier of the hierarchy of needs is basic needs, housing, safety, psychological needs, which is love and attention. So those are the basic needs. When we think about basic needs in a relationship, respect, honor, loyalty, trust, those are the basic needs in a effective communication, are some of the basic needs in a healthy relationship. And that is something that as a child you did not see growing up. Oftentimes the very thing that has caused you emotional injuries, because I also like to kind of move away from traumas to emotional injuries, because that's exactly what happens when we experience these different things in our childhood. They cause emotional injuries, which impacts how we are either able to emotionally regulate our emotions as adults, as well as communicate our emotions as an adult. And so it really does impact how we move emotionally in the world with ourselves and with others.
So Leslie, how can someone break a trauma bond when they've shared so many memories and time with this particular person, whether they've been in a relationship with this person for 5 years or a friendship for 10 years? If once listening to this episode and once recognizing that their relationship may have some trauma bonding signs and flags, how can someone start to pull away when, in a sense, based on their attachment style within the relationship, whether they have an anxious attachment style, or you said there were 3 others. What were the other 3?
So that actually the total 4.
There's 4.
Secure is the ideal attachment style. That's when a child's needs have been met by the parent, and that child turns into an adult who can move in relationship spaces with ease.
Okay.
There are 3 insecure attachment styles behind that: avoidant, anxious, and disorganized.
Avoidant, anxious, and disorganized.
Yes.
So based on these attachment styles, how can someone start to pull away and move into a more secure relationship?
Oh, that's a great question. First and foremost, if there is a recognition after listening to this podcast, like, they describe the relationship I'm in now, the first thing I would recommend is find a therapist to explore that. Because the only thing that you can do, the only person you're responsible for in the relationship is yourself. And if you recognize that, okay, this is what I've been enduring for a while and I've had all these memories, that's great. Some of those memories are probably really good. But if there were more bad times than good times, you may want to say, okay, how healthy has this relationship been for me? Have I grown in this relationship? So there's some questions that you need to start really kind of asking, your reflective question you need to start asking yourself. How have I benefited from this relationship? From a space of, have I grown emotionally? Are we emotionally connected in a healthy way? One of the first things you can do is assess the health of the relationship. Is it a healthy one? And then if you're able to say, well, it's not. Oftentimes I have couples come to me like, oh, we need to do couples work. and they'll go into what's happening in the relationship. And then I'll have them both do an average childhood experience questionnaire. And I'll look, and I'm like, oh, look, this is how you're showing up in a relationship, and this is how you're showing up in a relationship. What I recommend is that y'all do individual, because you bring your stuff to the relationship. You bring your childhood experiences, you bring all these learned behaviors, healthy, unhealthy, to the relationship. And the only person that you can address is yourself. So being very real with yourself is I think probably one of the first steps in breaking that pattern of behavior, that pattern of bonding in the relationship. What am I bringing to this relationship? Am I bringing my mommy issues, daddy issues, everybody issues into this relationship? Where am I emotionally and mentally? Am I emotionally and mentally healthy? Am I bringing these irrational core beliefs? I'm not good enough, or I'm not lovable, or I'm going to fail. Am I bringing these core beliefs into the relationship? So the first thing to do is recognizing the health of the relationship and recognizing your health and what you're bringing to the relationship in order to break the bond. Oftentimes, if both individuals are intent on working on their stuff, then they may find that the communication issue they were having may ease up a little, because sometimes the yelling comes because a child didn't feel heard as growing up. So therefore, as an adult, you're going to hear me. And so they're both yelling, and it's like, okay, but are you really hearing each other? And so again, it's about looking at self first. What am I bringing to the relationship?
So you touched on asking yourself what you bring to the relationship and whether or not the relationship you're in is healthy. So can you touch on what does a healthy relationship look like, and what do we need to look for?
Oh, excellent question. I'm glad you asked that question. So what an authentic bonding looks like. And I saw this graphic a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, oh, this is so on point. In a healthy relationship dynamic, both individuals are able to learn, see, and hold space for each other. They can have conflict, because if someone says, oh, we don't have conflict in our relationship, I'm like, okay, yeah, but okay. Everyone has some level of conflict. The key is, do you stay emotionally connected in the midst of the conflict? That's a healthy relationship. Do you sit there and actively listen to each other? Do you validate? You may not agree, but do you validate the other's feelings and how they may be experiencing you or the situation at the moment? There's also this needs are being met. You're not sacrificing your needs, and you're not expecting your partner to sacrifice their needs to make you feel good. There's this safe and consistency and insightfulness of each other within the relationship. And I mentioned earlier, it goes from the trauma bond of you complete me to we complement each other. We are in tune to each other's needs. We want to see each other thrive. Because when you kind of think of it from a perspective of trauma bond, you're surviving. You're surviving in that. You're trying to keep your head above water. And a really healthy relationship dynamic, you guys are thriving individually as well as a relationship, as a partnership, as a couple, as a team. You're thriving. And so that's what a healthy relationship looks like. A healthy relationship has boundaries. Healthy relationships, couples in a healthy relationship are able to define what their relationship represents, the values of the relationship, whether it's love, whether it's communication, respect, loyalty, trust, fun. They're able to say, this is what we want our relationship to represent. And so the biggest thing is boundaries. We talked about boundaries throughout our conversation, but boundaries are so important. Boundaries keep us safe, keep us emotionally and mentally safe.
So how does this tie into self-awareness?
Oh, self-awareness. Wow. It ties into self-awareness from this aspect. If you're not self-aware of how you show up in a relationship, if you don't take that time to be reflective and introspective, because that's what self-awareness is, it is the act of taking a look at oneself through reflection and introspection. And the most important thing from a therapist perspective, when we are seeing our clients, one of the biggest goals is for our client to grow in self-awareness, is to be aware of who they are and how they show up for themselves and how they show up for others. So I'm not sure that answered your question as it relates to self-awareness, but that's what self-awareness is.
It did. Perfect. It did. So I guess to piggyback on that question, why is being self-aware important in the relationships that we do have?
Being self-aware is important in relationships because it allows you to, in a non-judgmental, self-compassionate, self-loving way, examine how I'm showing up in the relationships, whether it's with the intimate partner or with my homegirls or my homeboys. Like, how am I showing up? Am I bringing all my baggage with me? And it's coming out in how I communicate. It's coming out in how I behave. Mm-hmm. Or am I self-aware where I recognize that, okay, because of certain things that happened in my past, I may show up this way. So let me address that, because I want to have a healthy dynamic with my partner or with my friends, and most importantly, with myself. So self-awareness is important because it really does give us an opportunity to see how we show up, see how we engage with others.
And while we're on the topic of self-awareness, what are 5 things that we can do today to be more self-aware within ourselves and in our relationships that we currently have and the relationships that we cultivate in the future?
PositivePsychology.com had a great article on ways to cultivate self-awareness. So I was like, oh, I'm going to use this because I think there were great tips and strategies to cultivate self-awareness. Number 1 was to create space and time. You have to be intentional about your self-awareness. You have to sit there and say, I want to have a time in which I reflect and I'm introspective about who I am, how I show up, what are my strengths, and what are my opportunities for growth. I don't like the word weakness. I think strengths and opportunities for growth, because we all have opportunities for growth. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is to practice mindfulness. Mindfulness is about being in the moment. Oftentimes we could be 5, 10, 12 minutes down the road and miss out on what's going on in the moment. So practicing mindfulness is a great way to cultivate self-awareness. And you could do that through yoga. You could do that through meditation. Some great ways to practice mindfulness. Number 3 is one of my all-time favorites, is journaling. Oftentimes our thoughts are so caught up in our head and they're just kind of swirling around. I call it the rabbit hole. Journaling gives us an opportunity to just kind of do what I call a data dump. Put it all on paper. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be a dissertation. It doesn't have to be perfect grammar. It doesn't have to have punctuation. Just get it out. Writing is very cathartic. It allows us to put into words and put in black and white those things that we may be processing. And oftentimes when we kind of see it in black and white, we're like, whoa, okay, I need to explore this more. And the beauty of it is no longer up here. It's no longer up in your head. Now it's on paper, but now I can see what I need to explore. active listening. And that is with, with others. A great way of self-awareness is participating in active listening. The most important aspect of communication is not talking. It is active listening. It is listening for the emotional cues from the person who's talking to you. It is looking at body language. It is looking at, the language that's being used. And in that, you're able to respond more from an emotional space versus that of logic. Because oftentimes we communicate and we listen to defend rather than listening to understand. So active listening gives us the opportunity to listen, to understand where the other person may be coming from. And last but certainly not least is gain a different perspective. That's asking for feedback. Ask your friends, how have I shown up for you in our friendship lately? And oftentimes your friends are going to give you that honest, loving assessment. Oftentimes we don't want to get that, what I call constructive feedback. A person who cares about you wants to see you thrive. They want to see you be your best self. So sometimes it may be gaining a different perspective, because oftentimes we're going to say, oh, girl, you're the bomb. You're going to tell yourself you're the bomb, and could be not too far from that, but may have some opportunities for growth. And a good friend, a therapist may actually be able to give you some different insight. Well, this is great. You're very strong in this. You might want to look at how you show up this way. Where do you think that might be coming from? And really kind of give you that opportunity to look at it from a different perspective. So I thought those 5 tips from positivepsychology.com were so on point. And I just had to share that because I was like, these are great ways to really increase your self-awareness.
Those are fantastic. And one thing that really stood out to me was when you talked about listening to understand. I actually have a mentor myself. He's a motivational speaker, and he's always telling me, Hannah, when you have a conversation with someone, don't listen to react. Don't listen to just say something, but listen to respond in a way that is both beneficial to you and that other person. This way, they know that you're giving them your undivided attention. And this way, you're able to communicate your boundaries and to communicate what your emotional needs are. This way, once they know, you can both come together and find the best solution.
Exactly. I think that one of the things with active listening is, and I often share this with couples, is clarification and summarization. Listening to understand. And once that person is finished talking, it's like, well, this is what I heard. And that person could say, oh yeah, that's exactly what I said. Or if that's was kind of off on what they said, they could kind of say, no, this is what I meant when I said this. So that there is an increased understanding between the two people who are communicating. That active listening is so important. And I will go further to say that active listening is really important as it relates to how you hear yourself. How are you listening to yourself? First and foremost, what are you saying to yourself? And often also, what are you listening? How are you listening to yourself? Because oftentimes our intuition is screaming, hey, red flag, or hey, step back. You don't have to be that stressed. Calm down. And to be able to listen to ourselves actively is such a gift, because it really shows up in how we also listen to others.
Exactly. And to also take that thought a little further, when we are communicating with someone, and it's important to know that when there is a problem, to not blame that problem on the other person. Because when you blame that person, you're seeing them as the cause of why you're feeling pain. When in reality, what's happening is that as two people with different perspectives, different belief systems, different opinions, who are raised differently, you have a problem at hand that you're both trying to fix. That's the end goal, to fix this problem so that you both can be in unison. And sometimes when we're blaming that person, maybe our intention isn't to necessarily hurt them, because we're projecting our own lack of emotional needs and what we didn't get as children, or maybe from something that traumatized us that we never really healed from. So it's important to also think about it in terms of that when you're in a relationship with someone, and to not be scared to use your voice. You know, that's not saying that you need to scream, but it's also important to be firm in what you're saying, and to not, you know, waver, not say like, this is what I feel comfortable about. And then if someone else says something, then you're like, wait, to not second question or second guess your feelings. And I think that's very important, because that's something that I've personally struggled with in the past. I do this thing where I'm having a deep conversation with someone, I'm explaining to them how I feel, and then they say, well, this is actually what I'm saying about it. Then it's like, okay, wait, so am I wrong for feeling this way? So it's important to be firm in yourself, know that your feelings matter, and that your emotional needs.
And to continue to extend on this thought, there is a tool that we typically share. It's called the I feel statement. And it's, I feel whatever you're feeling. Because again, not to blame, because you don't want to blame, but you want to let the person know, this is how I've experienced this situation. It's not blaming you. It's not judgmental, but this is how I feel when blah, blah, blah happens. And so, like, or I feel this way when I experience you in this space. And it's not blaming the person, because they, however they feel is just as valid. Their feelings matter. It's how do we get to a space of conflict? And you mentioned fixing a problem. I learned this little statistic some years ago that really shocked me, that 70% of conflict does not get resolved. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, what?
Wow.
Yes, this came out of some studies I did with through the Gottman Institute. They do a lot of great work on relationships. And yes, because of personalities, because of people's different ways of being brought up, which you mentioned, which is so true. Worldview perspectives are different. 70% of conflict doesn't get resolved. However, just because it doesn't get resolved doesn't mean that you can't stay emotionally connected in it.
Right.
And that is the key, is to be, and a huge part of that is active listening, effective communication. I can feel one way, you can feel one way, and it could be on totally different ends of the spectrum. The key is your feelings matter, my feelings matter. I'm actively listening to understand where you're coming from. You're actively listening to understand where I'm coming from, and recognizing that, okay, you know what? We may not disagree on this particular topic about where we're going to go eat. But your feelings are valid, my feelings are valid, and I honor what you're feeling, and you honor what I'm feeling. Okay.
Exactly.
Let's just make some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
Exactly.
And just
I love that. I love that.
And just go, because I think, again, it is about, like you said, recognize that each person's feelings matter, that you have a voice. Your voice deserves to be heard. And that goes the same with whomever you are engaging with. Your voice deserves to be heard. Your feelings are valid, and your feelings matter.
I think that is perfect, the way you just summed that up.
Yes.
Before I forget, I do have one last question for you.
Sure.
I'm very interested in the attachment styles that you talked about.
Okay.
There was avoidance, anxious. Is it disturbance?
Disorganized.
Disorganized. Okay, I was close.
So those are the three insecure attachment styles. Secure is that I don't want to use healthy, unhealthy, but secure versus, if you kind of look at it from perspective of secure versus insecure attachment styles, secure is secure.
Yes.
The insecure attachment styles are the anxious, the avoidant, and the disorganized.
Do you know if there is a way for me to figure out what my anxious style is?
Oh, okay. So there's a book called Attach, The New Science of Adult Attachment, How It can help you. And that is I can always forget the author's name. Oh, Amir Levine
Okay.
and Rachel Heller. Great book, not only for clinicians, but also people who just want to have a better understanding of what attachment styles mean. And if you're looking for, if you're trying to figure out whether or not what your attachment style is, if you Google attachment styles, there are several, let's see, there's several different websites you can go to that will kind of give you some information. Now, if you're trying to look for a quiz to kind of see about your attachment style, the one that I use, and it was really funny, I took the attachment style quiz in the midst of doing a trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy training, because they talked about that with adoptive families. And her name is Diane Poole, Poole Heller. And if you go to her website, and it's dianepooleheller.com, she actually has a quiz that you can take. And I was not surprised by my my score, but it also kind of made me think like, wow, that's why I show up some ways in some relationships, because I had my top score, my top attachment style was secure. But right underneath that, like right underneath it, was anxious. And I was like,
oh, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, perfect.
So it's a great resource, because I think when you have a better understanding, and again, that goes with self-awareness, right?
Yes.
I think if you have a better understanding of how I show up in relationships, it helps you to understand, oh, that's why I do that.
Yes.
And hopefully it will prompt you to be more introspective and reflective and say, you know what? I may need to talk to someone about this, because I want to be my best self, and I want to hashtag live my best life.
Exactly.
So hashtag live my best life is I want to be healthy, whole, and well.
Yeah.
So
thank you so much for that, Leslie. Leslie, you are amazing. You've shared so much knowledge, so much information on trauma bonding, self-awareness, what a healthy relationship looks like. And I want to thank you so much for taking your valuable time to spend it here with me.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Leslie. This is the end of the podcast. I do want to thank Leslie once again for taking the time to be here. And I also want to thank our audience for listening. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. The views and opinions expressed by podcast participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. This podcast content is made available for informational and educational purposes, and the VSC does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy or completeness of the content. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear, and you are not alone.